The desert sun blazed high over the open battlefield, but the heat did not match the fire in Khalid Ibn Walid's eyes. His horse snorted and pounded its hoofs on the sand, as if it too could feel the storm rising within its master. Dust curled behind them like the breath of war. His hand tightened around the hilt of his sword as he watched the enemy line stretch across the horizon. Not long ago, Khalid stood on the opposite side of this very war, once the fiercest warrior of the Quraysh, the commander who had led the defeat of the Muslims at Uhud. He was their nightmare, a man whose name struck fear across Arabia. But something had changed, something deep and unshakable. It began with a letter, a single piece of parchment carried by a secret believer, a cousin who had embraced Islam in silence and bravery. He found Khalid sitting under the shade of a tree near the outskirts of Mecca, his eyes fixed on the mountains, his heart tired of bloodshed. The letter was from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It said, "I know your strength, O Khalid, and I know your wisdom, but a man of your worth should not remain ignorant of the truth. Come to us, for like yours must not fight against Islam, but for it." Khalid read it again and again. Every word felt like a spark lighting the ashes in his soul. He had seen the Muslims, their strength, their patience, their unity. Even after loss, they never broke. They never begged. They stood for something greater than victory or revenge. He rode to Medina, silently, his heart pounding more than his horse hooves on the road ahead. When he arrived, the companions were cautious. They still remembered Uhud. They still remembered the sting of defeat. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, welcomed him with open arms and a smile. Khalid said, "I bear witness there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." The sword of Quraysh had changed hands now. On this battlefield, Khalid was no longer fighting for pride or tribe. He was fighting for truth and for the message that burned inside him with the same fire that once drove him to rage, but now drove him to justice. Enemy forces were larger, well-armed, and arrogant. They had underestimated the Muslims again, thinking Khalid would be just another new convert. But Khalid had not joined Islam with a soft heart. He had entered it with his full strength and his unwavering will. He lined his troops not just as soldiers, but as brothers. He walked through the ranks, speaking to each one by name, reminding them of Badr, reminding them of Uhud, not the losses but the lessons. Your swords are not raised for yourselves, but for Allah and for the people who will one day worship him in places where his name has never been heard. Battle began with a cloud of arrows. The sky darkened, but the hearts of the believers did not. Khalid moved like a shadow between lines. His strategy was unmatched, his speed frightening. He divided the army into small, flexible groups that moved like rivers, finding cracks in the enemy's rock. When one flank began to fall, he led the charge, himself cutting through the chaos, not like a commander, but like a man possessed with purpose. His sword found its mark again and again, but never with cruelty, only with precision. The way a farmer clears the field not out of hate, but for harvest hours passed, and the sand turned red under their feet. But the tide was turning. The enemy could not understand how such a small force broke them so easily. They had the numbers. Khalid had the heart, and more than that, he had the barakah of faith. A soldier fell beside him, and Khalid stopped to lift his head. The man whispered, "Yeah, Khalid, tell my mother I died with La ilaha illallah on my lips and a smile on my face." Khalid kissed his forehead and whispered, "I will." The ground shook with the final charge. The enemy fled, their commander captured, their pride shattered, and behind them stood Khalid, covered in dust and blood, but his eyes calm. Victory was not new to him, but this one felt different. It was not for his name or his tribe. It was for Allah and for the cause that had pulled him from the shadows of arrogance into the light of purpose. That night under the stars, the companions gathered around Khalid. No drums, no celebration, just quiet prayers and humble hearts. Khalid stood and said, "I was once your enemy, but Allah changed my heart. If he can guide me, then he can guide anyone. Never lose hope in what he can do." From that day, his title spread far and wide. Not just Khalid, son of Walid, but Sayfullah, the sword of Allah, not for his might alone, but for his obedience, for his humility, and for the way He turned from darkness to light with courage and without hesitation. He had many battles ahead, but tonight he would sleep knowing that for the first time in his life, he fought not for glory, but for truth. And this was only the beginning. The morning breeze carried the scent of victory across the camp. Khalid Ibn Walid sat in silent reflection, sharpening his sword not out of habit, but with intention. He remembered every moment of yesterday's battle not as a memory of triumph, but as a lesson to be improved. Around him, the Muslim soldiers began to stir, some praying, others tending to wounds or helping the injured. The mood was calm, but firm. They knew Khalid was already preparing for the next call from Medina, for the next city that needed light to replace its darkness. Soon a rider arrived from the Prophet, peace be upon him, with a message that would change the course of Islamic history. The Romans had begun to gather forces near the northern border. A storm was brewing in the land of the Byzantines, and they believed that Muslims would never dare to face such a mighty empire. Khalid rose immediately, his voice clear. We do not fight for numbers, we fight for Allah. Send word to the emir. Tell him I march by noon. His journey toward the Byzantine frontier was not easy. They passed harsh deserts, wild tribes, and towns that refused water or food to the Muslim army. Yet Khalid kept moving. His men never starved. They never turned back for each hardship. They whispered, Allah is with us, and pressed forward. When they reached the borderland of Muta, they discovered the reality. They would be facing an army of over 200,000 men. The Muslim force barely reached 3,000. Some companions were shaken not out of fear, but out of reason. Even Khalid sat alone under the moon, his fingers pressed in the sand, whispering guidance, seeking clarity. He remembered the Prophet's words, you are the sword of Allah, and Allah never leaves his sword in the hands of falsehood. At dawn, Khalid stood before his men, his armor shining, but his face filled with the serenity of faith. He said, today we fight not for survival, but for honor. We carry not just swords, but the trust of the messenger himself. Let your heart be firm, for what we do today will echo in the heavens. Battle of Muta erupted with a storm of sound. Shields clashed, arrows flew the air, thick with cries of devotion and fury. The Muslim army fought with unmatched heart, but one by one their commanders fell. Zayd ibn Haritha martyred, Jafar ibn Abi Talib martyred, Abdullah ibn Rawaha martyred. With each loss, the troops looked for someone to hold the banner, someone to keep the soul of the army from breaking. And Khalid stepped forward. He seized the flag, wrapped it tight around his forearm, and led a charge so swift, so devastating, that even the Roman lines faltered. His horse was struck, but he leaped onto another. His shield shattered, but he fought barehanded. Enemy tried to surround him, so he split the Muslim force into three, moving them with such brilliance that the Romans believed reinforcements had arrived. He rotated flanks, reversed directions, and broke traps before they formed. That day Khalid broke 9 swords, one after another, until finally the Romans began to retreat in confusion, thinking the Muslims had grown in number. By the will of Allah, the impossible became real, and Khalid turned what could have been a slaughter into a survival, into a message that numbers alone do not decide battles. When the Muslims returned to Medina, some expected scolding for not achieving full victory. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, smiled and said, Khalid is the sword of Allah drawn against the enemies of truth. From that day, the title was not just symbolic, it became a living legacy. Years passed and Khalid continued to lead with unmatched excellence. At Yamama against the false prophet Musaylima, at Iraq against the Persian Empire, and in Syria, where the Roman legions waited behind fortified cities. It was in Syria that the world began to realize Khalid was not just a warrior, but a master of military science. He studied the land, the roads, the rivers. He timed attacks not by daylight, but by moonlight. He turned deserts into shields and valleys into traps. In the Battle of Ajinadain, he led a force of 20,000 against 90,000 Roman soldiers. He placed archers along hidden slopes, spread misinformation to divide their ranks, and cut off water routes to weaken them from within. When the fighting began, Khalid did not command from the rear. He was always where the danger was. Greatest rallying men whose strength came from seeing him rise through fire and fury with unwavering certainty. One soldier once said, when we saw Khalid, we felt as if the angels themselves were behind us. But what made Khalid beloved was not just his courage, it was his heart. He never took war as a tool of pride. He never entered a city with arrogance. He respected treaties, honored civilians, and knelt in prayer beside the poorest of his soldiers. Once, in a captured city, a Christian priest approached him and said, "You are not like the warriors we have seen before." Khalid answered, "We do not fight to destroy, we fight so that no one is forced to kneel to another man again. Only to Allah." Despite his greatness, Khalid never forgot his place. He once cried when the Prophet passed away, saying, "I wished I could have given my sword for one more glance from him." Loyalty was unshaken, even when the Caliph Abu Bakr died and Umar ibn al-Khattab became the new Caliph. Khalid was removed from his position as supreme commander. Some men were angry. They could not understand why the sword of Allah was set aside. But Khalid did not flinch. He said, "I fought for Allah, not for Umar," and he continued to fight in the ranks, not as a general, but as a soldier, the same fire in his veins, the same love in his chest for Islam and for those who bore witness to its truth. As the battles spread across the Levant, Khalid remained a shadow of force. Whenever the enemy grew confident, they looked over their shoulder expecting him. He became legend, not by claiming it, but by living it. His name whispered in the tents of kings and in the prayers of the oppressed. Yet, deep inside, Khalid knew that the victories were never his. They were gifts from Allah, and he feared that one day he would become too proud. So he fasted more. He prayed more. He gave more. He trained the next generation of commanders not to follow his footsteps, to follow the light of Islam. And when the Prophet, peace be upon him, was no longer there to write letters, Khalid carried his words in his heart and let them guide his blade, his decisions, and his mercy. He was not just a sword, he was a hand that held the Ummah through one of its most fragile and transformative times. He taught that power without obedience is destruction, and that strategy without sincerity is failure. His most painful wound was yet to come, and it would not be from an enemy's blade. The night was cold in Homs. The stars watched silently over a tent where Khalid Ibn Walid lay wide awake, his body strong, but his heart wrestling with a storm of silence. He had just returned from one of his most brilliant campaigns, defeating a massive Roman garrison with a strategy no one expected. Yet no word of appreciation had come from Medina. No recognition, no reply, only a quiet order days before that echoed in his memory. "You are to be removed from command and replaced by Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah." He had not questioned it. He had not written back nor raised his voice. He walked into Abu Ubaidah's tent, embraced him with a full heart, and said, "I am your soldier, now command me as you will." But inside something had cracked. Not out of pride, but out of sorrow, not because he lost a position, but because he feared he had lost the trust of the leadership of Umar ibn al-Khattab. He had lived with fire in his chest for Islam. He had slept in tents and bloodied armor and shared his food with barefoot soldiers. He had bled with them, cried with them, and buried them. Now he wondered if it had all been misunderstood. Umar had his reasons. He feared the people had begun to love Khalid too much, that the Ummah might start relying on him rather than Allah. He saw danger in hero worship, and Khalid understood that, but it did not stop the ache that had formed in his soul. Days went on. Khalid continued to fight without hesitation, leading missions for Abu Ubaidah with full strength, never once holding back. Still the letters came with praise for others, never mentioning the one who turned defeat into victory with Allah's help. One day a young soldier sat beside him, noticing the distant look in Khalid's eyes, and said, "O Saifullah, are you not saddened by how they treat you now?" Khalid looked at him, his gaze steady, and said, "I did not fight for their praise, and I will not stop for their silence." That night he walked out of the camp and sat on a hill overlooking the darkened land. He remembered the Prophet, peace be upon him. He remembered the warmth in his smile, the strength in his eyes, the way he had once placed his blessed hand on Khalid's chest and prayed, "O Allah, guide him. He has a brilliant mind. Let it serve your cause." That was all Khalid had ever wanted, but now with the Prophet gone and the battles fading, he felt like a sword placed back into its sheath. His usefulness questioned his fire cooling. War in Syria drew to a close Muslim. Forces had taken city after city, the Roman Empire shattered by the discipline, mercy, and courage of those who once had no land to call their own. Khalid led many of those victories, but his name had begun to vanish from the scrolls of record. Emesa. He entered a church after the surrender. The Christian leaders had requested his presence not out of fear, but respect. They had heard of his justice, how he never harmed women, children, or the old, how he protected houses of worship and forgave those who resisted him with dignity inside the church. The bishop looked at him and said, "I do not fear your army. I fear the God that gives you such strength." Khalid replied, "We are nothing without him and everything through him." But even as these victories echoed, the personal weight inside him grew heavier. He no longer led armies. He no longer received letters from Medina. His tent was smaller, his supplies fewer, and yet he never asked for more. Then came the day he heard that Umar ibn al-Khattab was visiting Syria. Khalid rode with the rest to welcome the caliph, dust rising behind his horse, like a trail of questions in his mind. They met under a lone tree near the road between Damascus and Jerusalem. Umar descended from his camel dressed in plain clothes and sandals, his eyes weary from leadership and sleepless nights. Khalid approached, bowed, and embraced him, not with bitterness, but brotherhood. "O Umar," Khalid said, "I do not question your decisions. I only ask one thing: did I ever break your trust?" Umar looked at him for a long moment, then said, "No, Khalid, you never did. But I feared the people would begin to think victory came from your sword and not from Allah. So I removed the sword and showed them that it is the hand of Allah that brings triumph." Khalid nodded, the words cutting deeper than any blade, yet he accepted them. He had always accepted what Allah willed. Soon after, Khalid returned to Homs, no longer in command, no longer on the battlefield. He began spending his days in quiet prayer, teaching young soldiers, training orphans in the way of honor and discipline. He gave away most of his wealth, wore plain clothes, and fasted more days than he ate, but his health began to decline. Years of war had worn his body thin. His hands that once gripped 10 swords now trembled as he poured water for wudu only day. He looked at the sky and said, "I fought every battle with truth in my heart. I faced every enemy with courage, and still Allah has not written martyrdom for me." Wept not out of regret, but longing. The man who faced death 1,000 times in the name of Allah would now die on a bed. He whispered again, "I fought in over 100 battles, yet here I am dying like a camel in the corner of my house." His companions came to visit him, their eyes filled with tears and love. He told them, "Do not grieve for me. I am not dying without reward. I only wish to meet my beloved Prophet again and hear from his lips that I fulfilled my duty." As his final hours came, he called his servant and said, "Bring me my sword." The servant placed the rusted blade in his hand. Khalid smiled a warrior's farewell. He kissed it and said, "You served me well, but you were only metal. I was the servant of something far greater." When the breath left his body, the world felt it, as if a mountain had fallen, as if a star had faded. The news reached Medina, and Umar wept openly, saying, "Women will never give birth to another like Khalid." He was buried quietly, no grand tomb, no marble stones, just a patch of earth where once a lion had walked in humility, in fire and faith. And above his grave, the wind whispered his name, Khalid Ibn al-Walid. The sword of Allah returned to its master. The city of Homs lay under a sky painted in deep gold. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the narrow streets, the people moved slowly, respectfully, their eyes glancing toward a quiet home near the edge of the city, where the great warrior had returned to his lord. Khalid Ibn Walid was gone, but the echo of his life was just beginning to awaken in the hearts of those he had once led, protected, and inspired. There was no royal funeral, no decorated tomb, no parade of pride. Instead, a small gathering of companion students and common people stood in prayer around his resting place. The Imam whispered verses of the Quran. Khalid's armor lay beside his grave, worn dull but forever noble among Those gathered was a young boy no more than 12. His name was a mere son of one of Khalid's former soldiers. His father had died in battle years ago, but Khalid had taken the boy under his care, teaching him discipline, guiding him in prayer, helping him memorize the Quran, and training his mind before his sword. The boy stood quietly holding back tears and remembering the last words Khalid had spoken to him: be a servant of truth, not of applause. Fight with your heart, not for glory, but for justice, and always lower your head before Allah, even when the world lifts your name as the crowd. Dispersed Amir remained kneeling beside the grave, tracing the name Khalid into the sand with his finger, not to forget it, but to remember what it meant in Medina. The news reached the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, who had once removed Khalid from command. To protect the purity of the Muslim heart, now he sat alone in his room holding a letter in his hand. The messenger who had brought the news was still outside waiting for a reply, but Umar had not moved. His lips quivered and his eyes filled with something heavier than sorrow. He walked to the mosque that night and addressed the people. He said, "O believers, a man has returned to Allah today, who never lost a battle, yet never let pride enter his chest. Khalid was a sword drawn in the name of justice and love, and though he dies today, that sword still glows in our memory and must remain in our path back in Homs." Khalid's house remained as he left it, simple, clean, and full of books and worn maps. Many visitors came and went over the months to pay respects, to sit in the place where the great general had once sat, yet the house remained quiet and peaceful. It was Amir who began to collect Khalid's scrolls, notes, letters, and battlefield strategies, turning them into a small library, not to glorify war, but to remind future leaders how one must lead with humility, clarity, and responsibility. He wrote on the first page of the journal he compiled, "This is not the story of a man, it is the story of faith." Walking in armor, years passed, and Amir grew into a fine leader. He never chased power, he never sought command, but when it was offered, he never ran from it. He carried Khalid's sword into battle, once wrapped in the same cloth Khalid had used, and with every strike he whispered, "Bismillah, not for my name but for the truth." In one of the distant cities where Islam had recently reached, a Roman nobleman turned Muslim asked, "Tell me of this Khalid, for I hear his name more often than that of kings." Amir replied, "Khalid was not made by war, he was made by choice. The choice to walk away from pride, to bend his sword before the truth, to turn from being a general of falsehood into a warrior of light. And that is why we still speak of him." That nobleman wept and said, "Then Islam has truly won even among the enemies." Khalid had faced his name, became respected, not feared as a destroyer, but remembered as one who fought with ethics, who spared the weak, who spoke with wisdom. A captured general once told his people, "Khalid could have killed us all, but instead he offered us peace and gave us food. He was a lion who walked among lambs without harming them." As Islam spread beyond Arabia, into Persia, Egypt, North Africa, and deeper into Byzantium, Khalid's legacy traveled with it, not just in stories, but in principles, in the foundations of strategy, in how leaders addressed their troops, and most importantly, in how they remembered to kneel before the Creator before claiming any victory. Many decades later, an old man stood before Khalid's grave, placing his hand gently on the sand, and said, "I never met you, O sword of Allah, but I felt you every time. I chose courage over comfort, every time I forgave when I could have taken revenge, every time I stood for truth when it cost me everything. I remembered you not for your sword, but for the strength you showed when you lowered it." Generations rose and fell, and each time a leader was trained in the ways of justice, someone would bring up the story of Khalid ibn Walid, not just the general, but the man who wept at the loss of friends, who walked into battle with faith instead of fear, who gave his last days in quiet remembrance rather than clinging to power. A day came when one of the great scholars of the Ummah stood in a large gathering. He said, "If you want to know how Islam survived the storms of empires, look not at the palaces or the gold, but at the men like Khalid, who walked into the heart of fire, not for conquest, but for conviction in the hearts of the believers." Khalid, his grave remains still, but his legacy marched forward in every act of bravery, in every decision to defend thee, innocent in every word spoken in truth, even when the world demanded silence, and when the sands of time began to erase names from stone, the wind continued to whisper the one name carved not into earth, but into the soul of a nation. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, who never broke, who never bragged, who never begged for fame, and who gave everything without ever asking anything in returning. The end his life was not about victories or battles, it was about the transformation of a heart from resistance to submission, from pride to purpose, from enemy to protector, and through that transformation, he became not just a figure of history, but a timeless light for those who seek strength in service, not in power. This was the story of Khalid Ibn Walid, not just the man but the message, and the message still lives. The end.